Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, my head's spinning a bit after hearing my friends across the aisle. I heard our former speaker ask about whether we're better off now than we were 4 years ago, and actually ask how can people who perpetuated this economic disaster ask that question. And it was amazing because former Speaker Pelosi and I were on exactly the same wavelength. She was asking, are we better off now than you were 4 years ago? And I was thinking the same thing that she was. How could people who perpetuated this economic disaster ask that question? But she asked it anyway. Heard our friends talk about the economic disaster. Some of us remember back into the early point of the 21st century when there was an effort by first-term President Bush, George W. Bush, calling for reform of Fannie and Freddie. And I seem to recall my friend from Massachusetts who resisted such reform. In fact, there were people here on the Democratic side of the aisle that resisted such reform. They prevented such reform. There were members on the Republican side, not all of them, but there were members who were calling for reform of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. But it didn't happen. And in fact, our friends across the aisle were in control of the House and Senate for 4 years. In 2005 and 2006, as a freshman, I often heard our colleagues across the aisle asking how we could do such a terrible, terrible thing of spending $100 to $200 billion more than we had coming in. Little did we know, and they were right. They were right. We should not have been spending $160 billion more than we had coming in. The Democrats were right. And because Republicans did not stay true to what we had promised, our leadership just wouldn't dig in and stop it, even though we had a Republican president. You know, well, we got a Republican president, don't want to hurt his feelings. We spent $160 billion more than we had coming in. So the American public sounded like they weren't thrilled with what they heard from the Democrats, but they figured they'd give them a chance. So November 2006, Democrats, who had promised to end the deficit spending, took over. And the deficit spending, rather than coming under control, went out of sight. They passed the Dodd-Frank bill. It has historic overregulation of community banks. Now, why would a group who is so upset with Wall Street pass legislation that devastates community banks that are closest to the community, know the borrowers the best, that have been the real foundation of this country? Why would they strangle out community banks with this massive regulation that really doesn't hurt the massive big banks? Well, someone said years ago, follow the money. And if you look at the money that has been contributed to campaigns for many years, you find out that the Wall Street executives and their immediate family normally donate about 4 times more to Democrats than they do to Republicans. Now, the Wall Street executives have to endure being called fat cats by a Democratic president, but they know, perhaps it's a wink and a nod, I'll call you fat cats, but I'm going to destroy your competition. We'll get rid of the community banks. We'll strangle them with overregulation. They can't make loans. We'll threaten them through the FDIC and the regulators to prevent them from making loans that they know are to good, reliable people that have never missed a payment. We'll threaten them not to do that, and we'll choke them out, and the only people to be left are the big investment banks on Wall Street that got us into the big mess in the first place. So if you follow the money and you follow the contributions, you find out, gee, Democrats talk about Wall Street as if they're Republicans, but there are 4 times more Democrats on Wall Street as executives than there are Republicans. What a shock. Because they talk a good game. I thought for so long that Wall Street executives must be Republicans the way the Democrats talk. Not so. President Obama got 4 times more contributions from the executives and their immediate family than did a guy named John McCain. So, look on further. What about jobs? How about when we have a disaster by British Petroleum, who has been allowed to operate in the Gulf Coast with 800 or so egregious safety violations, but that's okay, according to the Obama administration, that they didn't want to step in. And I read an account that at the very time Deepwater Horizon had blown out, and this administration, the Obama administration, should have been all over them. The executives of British Petroleum were negotiating with the Democrats to be the one big oil company that rolled out support in favor of cap and trade. I said I wouldn't use the term crap and trade anymore, so I'll avoid saying that. But they had a big oil company that was willing to come out and support cap and trade. So certainly this administration and the Democrats in the House and Senate wouldn't want to do anything too detrimental to British Petroleum because they're going to come out on our side. That meant that they ended up actually believing BP when they said, oh, we'll get it under control. Well, they didn't get it under control. So then there was this bipartisan group of experts peer reviewing what was going on in the Gulf Coast. And they came back with a report that made recommendations of what should be done. One of those recommendations was not to have a moratorium on drilling, not only of the deep water, but also the very shallow water. They didn't recommend it. And yet this administration goes through and changes the report the way it's printed and put out so that it makes it sound like these experts recommended a moratorium. They did not. But that's the way this administration wanted to manipulate what the American public believed so that the president could sign off on a moratorium. And we, other than those precious lives that were lost and those who were harmed out there on the Deepwater Horizon rig because this administration had allowed them to continue to operate, the biggest damage to the people in the Gulf area was from the president's moratorium. There were people who were making $75,000 in salary working on rigs, and that was minimum basically from what I was told by people that worked on rigs. And that income stopped, and those families had nothing because this president perverted a report into making people believe that it said we should cut off drilling in the Gulf Coast, and it devastated so many in the Gulf Coast region. If you want to look at what the president really thinks about big oil companies, it's very similar to what is said and done about Wall Street. They call the Wall Street executives all kinds of names, wink, wink, nod, nod. We're going to pass legislation that eliminates your competition, and then you'll be in charge, and then maybe you can make 8 times charge, and then maybe you can make 8 times as many contributions to Democrats as you do to Republicans. in both Wall Street and among big oil. How? What would that happen? Well, if you read the bill that President Obama put together, and it was the second American Jobs Act that was filed, because I filed the first one, because he ran around the country for weeks saying pass the American Jobs Act. There wasn't one filed. I figured if he's going to run saying pass the American Jobs Act, there ought to be one. So I put a two-page bill together that would eliminate the 35% tariff we put on every American-made good by any company in America. If we eliminate that 35% tariff, also called a corporate tax, you would see companies flocking into America. You would see people with jobs. They wouldn't be standing in line trying to get food stamps, standing in line trying to get more government help. They would have a job and all the pride that comes from that, of doing a good job and making your own money and making your own way. But we have a group in this Congress in both ends of they're in the majority down in the Senate, in the minority down here, and it's certainly not all of my Democratic friends, but they think the best way to help a country is just to give away more of other people's money. If you look at the president's proposal in his so-called American Jobs Act, he told people, I'm going to just really take after big oil. Well, I was one who actually read all 135 or 38 pages, whatever it was. And in that last part is where he got around to big oil, except it doesn't hurt big oil. It absolutely devastates and would eliminate all of the small independent oil companies operating in America. And those small independent oil companies happen to drill and operate nearly 95% of all the oil and gas wells in America. He takes away deductions of the normal cost of doing business that anybody in business is allowed to take as a deduction. Why not? It's the cost of doing business. It's not profit. That way you only tax the profit. And it eliminates deductions that actually not help big oil company. They can't take those deductions. Only the small companies can take that deduction. So the president's plan, when you really look at it, instead of looking at what he actually did, or look at what he, instead of looking at what he says, look at what he did. What he did was provide the elimination of independent oil and gas companies in America, and you don't have to have been to an Ivy League school. In fact, you're better off maybe in figuring this out if you didn't, because he had a Harvard economic advisor at the time, and of course Art Laffer, I think the world of him. I think he's maybe the best economic advisor any president's ever had, despite his Harvard education. But you don't have to have an Ivy League education to understand that if this president had been successful in eliminating every independent oil and gas company, as his bill would have done, not only will you eliminate millions of jobs, including those who derive jobs from the independent oil and gas business as well as business itself, not only would you do that, you would eliminate most of the production in America. What does that do? That drives the price of oil and gasoline way up, dramatically up. Natural gas, oil, all of that goes dramatically up because the major oil companies in the world are not interested in coming in and operating smaller wells. They go for the big ones. That means there's no competition to the massive oil and gas companies in the world. I was shocked to find out in our Natural Resources Committee that if you look at all the oil and gas, the big oil companies in the world, and you see them listed just by how much they've got in reserves, the American companies like Exxon, way down the list. The biggest oil companies are those operating as single companies, OPEC, in OPEC nations. And what would this president do? He would do what he has done repeatedly. He would help foreign countries. He would help the bigger folks, the bigger oil companies. I'm sure it would have benefited the fat cats, as he calls them, on Wall Street. But it would have put out of business 94, 95% of the oil and gas wells in America. that meant everybody's price went up. How sad is it that one of the few promises, I don't know, it may be the main promise that he kept, was to drive up the cost of energy in America. Well, boy, has he done that. Now, I love having quotes from people who talk about the Congress being the worst Congress that they can recall, when, especially Republicans, when the body at the other end of the hall has not fulfilled the obligation that they are required by law to do, and that's pass a budget, not in over 3 years. So how are we going to get anything done in Congress when we got a Senate down there controlled by Democrats who say, we're not going to do our job, and we're going to leave over and over on recess, and we're never going to do our job, because if people saw what our budget really is, they get mad at us. So we don't want a budget. We just want to keep spending at these ridiculously high levels, and if we work through a budget, we might have to do like the House did when they worked through a budget. We might actually have to cut some things. And how incredibly disingenuous anyone in America who would stand up and say, gee, we really want to bring down our spending, and yet everything they propose, except for the military, creates more spending. How disingenuous if anybody in America stands up and says these Republicans want to cut Medicare. They're going to destroy Medicare. Because if they've been awake during any of the actual bills that have been passed by the Democrats, and especially during that whole long ordeal when the Democrats had the House, they had the Senate, they had the White House, and America made clear, we do not want Obamacare. They said, we don't care. We want it. It's going to be more government control. It really was about the GRE, the government running everything, not just health care. But by passage of Obamacare without one single Republican vote, not a one, it was completely done with Democratic votes. $716 billion in cuts to Medicare. The Democrats voted that in. The Democratic president signed it in. It devastates Medicare more than anything that's ever been done to Medicare, and it was without one single Republican vote. So how in the world could somebody come in here or anywhere and blame Republicans for wanting to cut Medicare? Now, I blame my leadership. Anybody who's around can find it. We should never have agreed with the Democrats to that stupid super committee deficit ceiling bill. We should not have. And I was assured, no. They don't want $300 billion, $400, $500 billion in cuts in Medicare, which would be a sequester if we don't. So they will come together. We'll reach an agreement. And I pointed out, these are the same people that cut $716 billion out of Medicaid or Medicare in Obamacare. So, of course, I pointed out, if they don't have this super committee structure and refuse to let there be any agreement, then there is no one in the country that can be blamed for cutting Medicare except the Democrats. But if they get this bill passed on the deficit raising bill, and it requires a super committee to reach agreement, if they can get that through and get us to go along with it thinking that they're going to actually reach an agreement, then they can stonewall, not reach an agreement, no matter what we offer. And then they get a twofer. They get massive hundreds of billions in cuts to our national security at a time when our national security has not been in this kind of jeopardy since 9/11. Actually, on 9/11, it wasn't in the kind of jeopardy we are right now today. But under this administration, we have seen a win in Iraq turned into a loss because of the the just total abandonment of what we created in the way of a friend in Iraq. Maliki, now he's no friend of mine. He says I can't come back in the country, but if I put myself in Maliki's situation, the leader of Iraq, and I know Obama said we're leaving, we're not leaving anybody, anything, we're leaving, and you're the leader in Iraq. You see America's pulling out. You see radical stuff going on across the border in Iran. Well, you realize America's not going to be around to keep any stability. I'm going to have to start doing what Iran says. And so what did we do? We created a country. We had a victory. Everybody said, even though President Obama as a senator was against the surge, it worked. We won. And then he pulls us out in such a way that he snatched defeat out of the jaws of victory. And now you got Iraq that is under heavy influence by Iran. Thank you, President Obama. We've got Syria that is run by a tyrant. Perhaps Syria was the only place we should have intervened, and this president still hadn't gone in to help there. Oh no, because the 57 states that make up the Organization of Islamic Conference, they were all for us going into Egypt and going into Libya and taking out two people with whom this administration had agreements. They love the idea of America taking out and helping take out people that were allies of ours. They love that. And some of us in this body were saying, don't do this. You know, we don't know who's going to take over. This could be some radicals that will even empower the radicals more. I mean, you look across Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt, and Iraq, and Iran, and Syria, Lebanon. You look at these countries and come on over to Afghanistan that this president is losing as we speak, and Pakistan, which has been harming us all they could while still taking our money. Thank you, Secretary of State Clinton and President Obama. You look and you go, oh, my gosh, this is the makings. This is the beginnings, a massive beginning of a new Ottoman Empire that President Obama can take great credit for. You know, yeah, we're in big trouble here in America, but wow, look what he has helped do. It's a new Ottoman Empire. Thank you, President Barack Hussein Obama. This will be quite a legacy for you. And I'm not one of those who says he's not a Christian. All I know is that's between him and God. But what I do know is he has helped jumpstart a new Ottoman Empire and left our friend and ally Israel so vulnerable in this sea of radicalism that he has helped bring to the surface. And how could any of us who were around in 79 not be reminded of President Carter, who's got to be happy? Thank you. Now I'm not the worst president in the world. He's got to be happy, but at the time he thought we'll just turn our backs on the Shah. Not a nice guy, but he was creating some form of stability. But when he was gone, President Carter called Ayatollah Khomeini a man of peace. What a welcome thing. And he came in, and he was the supreme leader when our embassy was attacked, which is an act of war, just as it was in Libya, just like it is in Cairo. It's an act of war. And any commander would make it clear, except President Carter and President Obama. You've attacked American soil. You've attacked us under everybody's form of international law. You either straighten it out or we're coming in, because we have a right under international law to protect ourselves. And if it means taking your government out because of what you've done or allowed to be done or helped foment, then we do it. And in Egypt, this administration helped bring about what they thought would be a great thing, an Arab Spring. And it's turned into an American winter. At the same time, this administration was blessing and loving the Occupy Wall Street movement, even though they were clearly a bunch of Democrats, a bunch of kids with iPads, iPhones out there, drugs, all kinds of illegality and immorality out there abounding. And this administration is saying this is a good thing. And you see the signs all over the place. Let me see. On the Occupy movement, you'd see these signs like this, ACAB. All cops are, some people said bad, but I've been corrected. It has to do, the B stands for something to do with fatherless children. ACAB, that's the Occupy Oakland. But you can look at pictures. You see all these Occupy movements, ACAB everywhere. Well, I was a little shocked. One of my staff points out, look at that. This is on the wall in Egypt, and I need somebody to explain how among all of this Arabic writing by the radicals that have charged our embassy in Egypt, how in the middle of all this Arabic do we get ACAB? Who's doing that? I mean, there were rumors of some type of collusion, but who among those radicals in Egypt is writing ACAB, which is what you see at all the Occupy movements in America? Somebody's got some explaining to do, I would think, but not to this administration, because this administration thinks both the Occupy movement and the Arab Spring are a great thing, even though it's brought to power radicals who want to destroy America, who want to destroy Israel. How frustrating for our friend Israel. And when we have friends come in here in the last hour who were talking about Fannie and Freddie on a personal basis, Barney Frank, he is a brilliant guy. But it's not that hard to go back and find quotes from him about what the wonderful condition Fannie and Freddie were in. And it's not hard to find people here on Capitol Hill that can explain how he stood in the way of the reforms that some here on Capitol Hill wanted to do. We also heard from him that in 22 there were a bunch elected who don't understand Congress in a free society. Well, they were called extremists. These freshmen that came in saying, you know what? Everybody should pay their fair share. It shouldn't be 51% of Americans paying for everybody else just because Democrats want to keep people beholding to them so they'll keep voting for them. Because once we get one more than half of all the voters who are getting more than they're putting in, we've lost the country. It will be in complete demise. It may be 10 years or so. But once we get to that point, historically, you do not get that country back. And we would not either, absent a miracle of God. We were told during the conventions, the Republicans do not have a franchise on God. Everybody in the Democratic convention, we love God, we worship God, we love Israel, we like Jerusalem as the capital. We heard all this stuff until there was a vote, and holy cow, we saw plain and clear that everybody in the Democratic convention does not want God mentioned. They don't want to hear about God. They don't want to hear about Jerusalem being the capital of Israel. They don't want it. They side more apparently with Palestinians, all you can figure, than they do those who were possessing and in that land 1600 before there was a man ever talked about named Muhammad. King David was there in Hebron, which now we're told, oh, do the Israelis have history in this land? It's where David ruled for 7 years, about 16, 17 centuries before anybody ever heard of Muhammad. So how would they not have a history in that land? When I was talking to the Prime Minister Netanyahu about the history in the land, he mentioned the story of Ben-Gurion, who led the ragtag forces to fight their way back up to Jerusalem after overwhelming forces had driven them out. But the story was, and this was the first I'd heard it when the Prime Minister mentioned it to me, but I've heard it a number of times since. And he said Ben-Gurion was challenged. What is your voucher for claiming this land? And Prime Minister Netanyahu used the word Bible. I'm sure it was a Torah, but Ben-Gurion held up, he said, a Bible and yelled, "This is my voucher." Do they have a history in the land? How blind do you have to be to not see it? Cap and trade legislation. Thankfully, we had just a handful of enough friends on the Democratic side of the aisle that we were able to stop that. Or it would have tripled, quadrupled the price of gasoline. It would have devastated industry. Industry would have had to leave in even bigger numbers from this country. We were told about the Bush stimulus, that they got bipartisan votes on the Bush stimulus. Well, I guess so. Anytime either party talks about giving away other people's money, we're going to get a bunch of Democrats to go along with the Republicans that mistakenly agree to that. I'm the one that asked President Bush, stand right here in this aisle as he came by. We'd found out that $40 billion of the $160 billion Bush stimulus was going to go to people as rebates, even though they didn't pay income tax. That's when I asked the question, standing right up there, Mr. President, how do you give a rebate to somebody that didn't put any bait in? It's not a rebate. It's welfare. Call it what it is. My friends across the aisle in the last hour said they couldn't even get 100 votes to support President Bush's effort to save the economy. He's talking about TARP. Oh, I would have supported President Bush's efforts to save the economy, but unfortunately, that really good man, smarter than most people around here give him credit for, witty, clever, just a joy to be around. But the problem there was he listened to Hank Paulson and his cronies who were going to bail out their buddies who give 4-1 to Democrats over Republicans. That's what happened. So Paulson did get his way, but we didn't have 100 people on the Republican side of the aisle vote for that, because there's an FDIC former chair named Isaacs. He and a bunch of economists had some recommendations. These are free market recommendations. The projection was even then that we have at least $1 billion in banks overseas that American companies and American individuals earned overseas. And they know if they bring it into the U.S., they'll have to pay 40-50% tax with all the interest and penalties. So they just leave it in banks overseas. They'd love it to bring it in here. But we're the only country that double taxes because we don't let people bring in money without hammering the heck out of them, even though they've done a favor, done a good thing, and earned money overseas that they'd like to bring here into America. And the proposal was all you have to do is say, look, instead of borrowing 42 cents out of every dollar and coming up with $700 billion to give away to Hank Paulson so he can enrich his friends, and under that bill, I read it. It was a disaster. I couldn't vote for that because I read it. Let him give money away to anybody he wants to, loan money to whoever he wants to, pay more than fair market value. If in his mind somehow, some way, someday it might help some possible way of helping our economy do whatever we want to. We don't do that in America, and that bill did it, and that's why you didn't have 100 votes on this Republican side of the aisle for it. And our leadership made a mistake in supporting it on that Friday. Just call them like I see them. That was a mistake. But that's where we are. We heard in the last hour about Republicans who say, my way or the highway. Are you kidding me? We reached across the aisle during Obamacare and say, look, there's a bunch of these things we can agree on. Insurance for people in your household under 26. We could do it for, insurance across state lines. There are a number of things we could agree on. Insurance companies shouldn't be able to punish people for having a pre-existing condition, when the insured has acted in good faith all along the way and the insured messes them around. Willing to work things out. They said, we've got the votes. We don't need your votes. We don't want them. Well, the truth is we want Democratic votes on the Republican side, but we don't want to keep taking other people's money to give it away. I've heard in here so many times, well, Jesus talked about helping other people, the orphans and widows. Well, a lot of us belong to churches, and we believe in doing that, that is what Jesus said to do. But I can't find anywhere in the Bible that it says, go ye therefore take somebody else's money, because you don't want to do your own. Take somebody else's money and help the widows and orphans and other people. He said, you do it. You help them. And when you do that, I can personally tell you, when you do that, you're individually blessed. And that's why Jesus said it. He knew it would bless the giver more even than the one who received the gift. And in fact, you want a real example? What did Zacchaeus do after he met Jesus? He went and cut taxes. You don't even have to give in to the fact that he was going to give a 4-to-1 rebate, did, to people that he had wronged. You don't hear that around here. And then to continue to hear our friends talk about ending Medicare as we know it, that disastrous Obamacare bill will end Medicare forever. When you cut $716 billion, when you create this Obamacare monstrosity, it's a government takeover of so many things, and it's disastrous. So yeah, we're having to leave here, and I'm not happy about it. I didn't want another CR passed. We should have demanded that this Democratic majority at the other end of the hall stick around until they got a budget as the law requires them to do, and don't leave until you do it, and let's stay here and get it. And I can promise my friends across the aisle that all we have to hear is the inclination that the Democrats, controlled by Harry Reid in the Senate, as dictated by President Obama down Pennsylvania Avenue, if they want to work a budget together and we can work these things out together, we will come back in a heartbeat. We'll be ready to go. But we saw with that super committee, just as I predicted in July of last year, they didn't want an agreement. And apparently my friends who were talking in the last hour didn't know, but Pat Toomey and some others made a proposal that would have caused more taxes to have to be paid by the wealthiest in the nation that are already, the top 1% paying 39% of the taxes. Well, if they get 39% of the income, they should. But they only get 13% of the income. But they want them to pay more. And here was a proposal in good faith by Republicans, we'll raise revenue. And it was reported here locally that, some of the Democrats said, you know, this may do the trick. We may get to an agreement now. This is great. Thanks for doing this. Since you're willing to raise revenue on the rich, we can reach an agreement. And then they go away, and they must have talked to Harry Reid and President Obama, and all you can see the game plan. You got to go back and tell them we're not going to reach an agreement, because our best hope for winning the presidency again and having control in the Senate is if we tell America the Republicans won't reach an agreement, they're a do-nothing group. And I hope and pray people will look beyond that and see who really is the do-nothing. We got jobs bills down the hall. Man, this ought to be a day of renaissance. This ought to be a day when the economy is booming. We now know we could be exporters of energy. We could be energy independent and export energy. But this president has a war against all of the below. That means all the energy below the ground that we could be and export. He got a war against it. And all he is in favor, as he said, he's for all of the above. That means wind and solar. Well, guess what? The sun doesn't always shine. The wind doesn't always blow. So if that's what you want for energy, it means you're going to have a coal plant, a natural gas plant, something, a hydroelectric plant, and then you're going to have 2 or 3 times as many transmission lines, because when you mandate wind and solar and they don't provide energy all the time, they can't, then you're going to have a source from somewhere. So now we're doubling and tripling and going to force the price of energy to continue to go up, because we're going to demand cylinders and that kind of thing so this administration can reward their cronies. Well, we're at trouble within and without, and I just want to remind my friends that this was reported in the New York Times, December